So overall, we took a few days to process this. We all know that the Mets have been eliminated from the playoffs. A lot of anger, a lot of frustration coming out of just 3 extra games past 162. Even though we're going to have tons of videos talking about what happened this season, stuff going into the offseason, we're just going to lay it all down on the line and give you the raw emotion of how we've been really feeling in these past few hours. And that brings us to the question, how bad did the Mets fail?
On 3-2, Vader swings and misses, strike three. He struck him out. 5 Met pitchers combined for the second no-hitter in New York Mets history.
So like I said, we took a breather on this because we did not want to put any recency bias behind it. But I would say that one of the falling actions has been how they played September baseball. We've talked about this a lot, but it just did not seem like the magic carried over from the first 4 to 5 months into the month of September, which is obviously the most important month to play baseball. So before we get into this whole direction, I'm going to just ask you this question purely. How bad did the Mets fail this season?
Yeah, this is a catastrophic failure. And you can already say, hey, Andrew, what are you talking about, Rhino? They had the second most wins in franchise history, which is true. But guess what? You played 165 games. And if you told me before the season, hey, Jeff McNeil's winning the batting title, Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor are 2 top 10 to top 12 MVP candidates, all of this, and you win 101 games, I would be jumping for joy. Where the hell do I suck? This team was great in April, was great in May, was great in June. July kind of started the tailspin. And then in September, which we all circled being like, hey, it's a bunch of bottom feeders. Hey, this is a time you had the big lead against Atlanta. You let that squander, be like, you know what? You got bad teams you can beat up on, and you know what? You can get the lead back and still win the division. And the way that they just fell out flat in September, like you said, that kind of magic ran out, and the Braves magic picked up. We'll talk about that series in Atlanta as well. It just kind of ended the season, and then you get the matchup of San Diego, and we didn't match up well against them in the regular season, and you saw Yu Darvish, and you knew, okay, this is going to be tough, and yay, the season lasted 3 extra days. Just to sum it up, it does suck, and it is a failure, and Lowell Mets continues to live on.
I'd say it's one of those historically in our face type of failures. Yes, it was one of the best regular seasons this franchise has ever had. Does it say much looking back at all 60 plus years of this franchise? No, but it definitely was a feeling that we really weren't used to, or a feeling that we really have not seen sustained throughout this franchise. The problem with this is that we created history this year, but the wrong history. We all know that we are the first ever 100 plus win team to not make it to the division series. And you can give us the benefit of the doubt of how past that June 1st to July deadline, this team did play good, but the competition just played better. We talked all about going into that Atlanta series. We won 9 out of the 15 games with the Atlanta Braves. So we had the head-to-head matchup with them. We had tons of stories of the Braves not doing well against teams over 500 and us doing extremely well against teams above 500. The Mets had the ball in their court and they fumbled it. But if you were to look at it from one pure point, if they won one game in Atlanta, they would be playing the Phillies tonight at Citi Field.
And then piggybacking that point, it didn't even have to be one game in Atlanta. It would be, win one game against the Chicago Cubs. Don't let the Washington Nationals come into your ballpark and win 2 out of 3. Then you get to that Atlanta. Obviously, we all had it circled preseason when we saw it was originally the last 3 games of the season. Obviously, the lockout, the Mets needed one win. One win in Atlanta, and they controlled their own destiny, which guess what? They did sweep the Washington Nationals in those last 3 games. So they win one. They would be, like you said, taking on the Philadelphia Phillies. And guess what? They probably win game 1 because they know how to beat the Philadelphia Phillies. And you had everything in your advantage. You had your big 3 lined up, DeGrom, Scherzer, Bass. And you got 3 consecutive stinkers. Not to help the fact that the offense decides to go ice cold as always. Everyone said you had the advantage. You had the ace advantage. You had the pitching advantage. The only thing Atlanta has was that stupid ballpark. So as soon as that happened, you knew the season was over. And even though people were like, the season's not over. As soon as you lost that series and got swept, you knew it was over. As soon as that slap in the face to reality that you're not the best team in the NL East anymore, you're second best, and the best that you can do is still second to the Braves. It was a complete embarrassment.
Both of the teams ended with 101 wins. So it makes you really think that one squandered opportunity, maybe one stupid loss in Miami once, or maybe a one against the Giants in San Francisco was the deciding factor. Shoulda, woulda, coulda. Now you get into this team's full-on problems of why they just were not good enough. I'd say one of the biggest problems that they face, and we've talked about this a lot, is how flawed and inconsistent the offense was all season, and especially towards at least the last 2 months of the season. If you went throughout that lineup, the top four was our most productive spot for the entire offense, leading off with Nimmo, Marte, Lindor, and then Alonso. That was one of our main winning formulas. One of the biggest problems was that you had a lot of unsustainable abilities from Nimmo and Marte, who hit the ball on the ground a lot, and both of them are leadoff hitters, so they could counteract with each other sometimes, but it wasn't the main concern. Pete Alonso and Francisco Lindor, both of them combined for over 200 runs batted in this season. If they weren't hitting either together or if Alonso wasn't pure hitting, this offense was not succeeding at all. You look past the top four. No offensive production from the 9-hole with the catcher position. Overall, in this entire lineup and this entire roster, there's way too many leadoff hitters. And this was a problem that we pointed out before game 1 of 162. Brandon Nimmo, Jeff McNeil, Starling Marte, Luis Guillorme, who was known as a regular irregular, Mark Canha. All of these guys are leadoff hitters. It would have been nice to spread them around the entire lineup, but since you had zero protection for Pete Alonso, there was no consistency outside of that top four. And it got even worse when Marte got hurt in the middle of September. So the dynamic shifted to an even worse degree.
They made it clear that Eric Chavez's approach was they wanted to grind out ABs and, not hit home runs. And that should have been the biggest red flag in today's game, where today the home run ball is more valuable. The Mets obviously have these singles and doubles hitters, and you saw when they're going well, they did be able to mount rallies and beat up on bad pitching and hit singles and consistently draw walks. Today's game, where extra base hits are more valuable as ever, especially with pitchers being throwing harder and strikeouts being big as they are. You want your best swing. If you could hit it, make contact, you want it to go far and go out of the ballpark. And that was the biggest problem. We said it when we looked at the roster. Like you said, it's a lot of guys who draw walks. We thought Eduardo Escobar could have been a secondary to, third power source. Third, he was technically with Lindor, but like you see, Lindor is more of a singles and doubles guy. Pete was being the only straight up just masher that taking the strikeouts but wants to hit homers. Again, look at the best teams in baseball: the Dodgers, the Astros, the Mariners, all the teams that are currently in the playoffs. What do they all do? They all hit home. Mets never did. The well was going to run out. The singles are going to run out when you face good pitching. Again, Chavez, I'm not calling for his head because I think he did provide offense. This was the best Mets offense we've seen in a while. But I think he needs to realize how today's game and needs to realize how important the home run ball is. That maybe I'll take some more strikeouts. It provides more power. It can easily put runs on the board faster than having to hit 3 straight singles, especially with this team not being athletic, not being fast. They're all pretty fat, and you're hitting these singles and walks. Everybody's only moving one base at a time.
I think one of my problems with this approach from the beginning was the lack of balance. I think we already have exposed that type of approach of putting the ball in play, grinding out ABs, but we never really had someone that could 100% step up, pitching around Alonso and hit the ball out of the ballpark. Now, the Mets loved this approach of Sandy Ball. A lot of guys hitting a lot of home runs, but you saw a team that strikes out a lot. They just don't know how to find that balance. And compared to teams like the Dodgers, the Padres, the Astros, they do. The Mets have really flip-flopped from one non-sustainable approach to another, in my opinion. And even though Pete Alonso is the one that keeps it sustainable, so can Francisco Lindor as well. But it just isn't enough with no power protection for him. And as for that power protection, I'd say that the main graveyard of this whole situation was the DH and how they basically approached it. Robinson Cano comes into spring training, should have been bought out. we already knew that he had nothing left in the tank. We could tell. And that prediction pretty much came true when he was DFA'd by 3 teams, one of them being the Mets, one of them being the Padres, and then the Braves. They came in with the mindset of him being the everyday DH, where he has a good history against righties and lefties, but his power's gone. We also had Dom Smith coming off a terrible, terrible year with an approach of quality ABs, not striking out, drawing walks, putting the ball in play. We knew that Dom Smith was probably there to fail from the start. You also had JD Davis, who walked a little bit, but struck out a lot, couldn't hit a fastball. And when you are a balanced hitter, you need to know how to hit a fastball. They tried to fix this with bringing in Daniel Vogelbach and Darren Ruff as that certain platoon. 2 guys who most likely can't play any position because one is 36 years old. The other one is a big boy that doesn't move that well. And this position has had such a stagnant and inconsistent and very low production throughout 162 games. The power protection behind Alonso was nowhere. The dynamic in the lineup past the 4th spot was terrible. I'm not saying that Mark Canha and Eduardo Escobar and all these other guys had bad seasons and they were horrible all year. But at the end of the day, after 162 games, after 165 games, they did not have a sustainable group after Pete Alonso.
The most generic answer that people on Twitter hate to hear it, but it's true. The fact that the New York Mets at the trade deadline had every asset and should have thought, you know what, look how many pending UFAs we have. The fact that they did not go all out, the fact that they held Mark Vientos in such high estate that you couldn't win and maybe traded him for Wilson Contreras, JD Martinez, whoever. And yes, did those guys have great second halves? No, but they were both in 2 horrible situations. Maybe not. There was rumors that it would have been Mark Vientos for Trey Mancini. Did the Mets not pull the trigger, potentially getting Dylan Tate, I think was the original rumor name from the Orioles out of their bullpen? These guys were better options and had, Vogelbach had its moments. Darren Ruff should have just hanged out with Frank in the retirement home and never play baseball again. You saw that as the Mets needed bats. And consistently, we've said it all year, the power protection from Pete. Add some power. They didn't want to do that. They wanted the Tampa Bay Ray their way with, let's create a DH instead of just going out and getting the guy so you don't have to burn 3 roster spots to actually get some more flexibility, potentially getting another backup infielder, another backup outfielder. But no, we have to have 3 people when they called up Mark Vientos with Darren Ruff, Mark Vientos, and Darren Ruff, and they were all on the roster at the same time. 3 guys that play no positions but DH. And we've made that clear that the bench sucked, and we saw it in the playoffs. It was just Luis Guillorme as the only backup infielder on the bench, and that's a problem. So the fact that they just did not want to make one move to solidify the DH, to maybe make additional moves to add an extra utility guy, if it was like a John Birdie type player, just to throw a type of player out there who can play infield, outfield, provide some speed. But the bench was non-existent. And the fact that they just weren't willing to go out and take the risk. Because, again, we don't know what this roster will look like. You have Jake under contract this year. You had Nimmo. You have all these pending UFAs. You had guaranteed to be on this roster this year. And the fact that they were not willing to go to that nth degree to put themselves in the best situation to win, that definitely is going to come back to haunt. And it definitely did come back to haunt them in the end.
We talked about the lack of depth on this roster and how they love to play 26 to 26. There just really wasn't that many major league caliber guys that you could put on maybe a playoff roster. Tyler Naquin, Daniel Vogelbach, and Darren Ruff, all 3 of those hitters, they most succeed whether in a platoon or coming off the bench. I do think that Daniel Vogelbach is a great hitter, but he can be very one-dimensional as for his value, and that's the reason why I think he belonged on the bench. He couldn't be the main power protection for Pete Alonso. Daniel Vogelbach is great, and I'm sure Darren Ruff, maybe he was supposed to be a lot better, but they're not a frontline hitter that brings in fear 100% to the pitcher once you intentionally walk Pete Alonso or pitch around him. They're not the caliber of JD Martinez. They're not the caliber of Trey Mancini, Wilson Contreras, all of these guys that should have been the main power protection for Alonso. Darren Ruff looked like the extra lefty killer off the bench. Daniel Vogelbach looked like the extra righty killer off the bench. It basically looked like the approach of them trying to replace with 2 other guys who are not starting caliber players. They needed that frontline bat, and they didn't get it. And that's what really cost them for a sustainable offense, at least 1 through 8. And when Alonso and Lindor went through their rough stretches, the offense was nothing. It was completely dry. There really is so much that went on during this 162 game season, and a lot of factors that really unraveled towards the end of the year. Whether it was key injuries or the lack of depth on this roster, or the fact that the team that we were competing with just played better than us, at the end of the day, they missed a lot of opportunities. They had the table set for them way too many times, and they fumbled it. Even though there's a lot of fingers you can point at different people, who would you say was the main reason why?
Yeah, I think obviously you could give some of the blame to Billy. Every one of his acquisitions paid dividends and was a productive signing. You could spell some to Buck Showalter because his in-game managing in September was maybe unique. But I think Epler obviously needs to get some hate. You should have seen. You don't know what your roster is going to look like next year, and the fact that you were like, no, I want to believe in Trevor May. I want to believe in injured arms and kind of doing the Wilpon moves when we have Steve Cohen now, where Cohen should be like, you have depth on top of depth, and the fact that he wasn't willing to take some waiver claim bullpen arms when the bullpen was hurt, the fact that he didn't want to pick anybody up, the fact obviously going back to the deadline, not having the aggressiveness that a la the Padres had and when the Braves had, when they had a hole, they didn't go in the bargain bin, they went out and got the top option, or surprising everybody to take on a bad contract and then going back to his true form. Epler did a great job in the offseason, fumbled the deadline, and when we all said you needed to build a team to get to the deadline and then add at the deadline, he did it on the margins and didn't do it enough, and that came back to bite him in October.
I also am going to put a little bit of heat on Billy Epler, only because it just felt like they built something that had special potential, but they just didn't finish the job. And you really can translate that to how it looked out on the field. They had their opportunity and they fumbled it. Bringing in Max Scherzer, bringing in Starling Marte, bringing in Eduardo Escobar, Mark Canha, Chris Bassett, Adam Ottavino, all of these vets, these established vets, it was a win-now team. They had their glaring weaknesses, and they just did not approach it like a big market team should. And even if it wasn't a big market approach, you can also talk about the fact that it just didn't match up well to teams that were in a better position and teams that were more World Series contenders than us. It just feels like they did just enough to hang around, and that's what really caught up to them at the end. This is the main reason why we say it's a collective group effort as to why this team failed. After the trade deadline, though, I would say that it was easy enough to say that this team didn't have enough to go all the way. We talk about a lot of unsustainability on this team. They had a lot of it from top to bottom, whether it was from the front office, whether it was from the health of players in the rotation or health of players on the field, whether it was an offensive approach where a lot of things had to go right for them to full on succeed. They just set themselves up for failure where they just didn't finish the job. And I personally think they had too top heavy of a roster to do so. The approach in the front office definitely reflected to the play on the field. All in all, I'd say that this was disappointing. It really was. With all the promise that was created in the first 4 to 5 months with this team, and it seems like it was spreading across to a lot of amazing individual performances all year. I think there is a lot of blame that you can point out to many different aspects in this organization. We all know that they're just not ready to play with the big boys. We knew it just was not enough. Even though this team is mega talented and has amazing pieces, it just didn't have enough to go the distance. And whether you saw that or not, or believe that or not, that's why it was a disappointment. I personally saw us coming up short with the approach that they took in different parts of the season. A lot of aspects on this team that just looked like they were going to get exposed. And they did. I would describe this season in 2 words, and that would be wasted potential.